Welcome to Gender 101, a discussion on gender identity and expression, part of the Yale Alumni Association's Impact 2 conference. This session is co-sponsored by Yale Gala, Yale's LGBTQ Alumni Association, Yale Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Yale LGBT Studies. I am honored to introduce the moderator of the event, Evren Savci, who is Assistant Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. Her first book, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics Under Neoliberal Islam, analyzes sexual politics under contemporary Turkey's AKP regime with an eye to the travel and translation of sexual political vocabulary. Her second book project, tentatively entitled Failures of Modernization, Polygamy, Islamic Matrimony, and Cousin Marriages in the Turkish Republic, turns to these sexual practices that were deemed uncivilized and either heavily discouraged or outlawed by the Turkish Republic. Savci's work on the intersections of language, knowledge, sexual politics, neoliberalism, and religion has appeared in the Journal of Marriage and the Family, Ethnography, Sexualities, Political Power and Social Theory, Theory and Event, the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, and GLQ, and in several edited collections.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session of the Impact Series. This session is co-sponsored by Yale Gala, WGSS, and LGBT Studies. My name is Evren Savci. I'm Assistant Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale. And I also want to say that this session we're doing in loving memory of Andrew Dow, our beloved colleague, friend, teacher, and mentor to many of our students and an amazing community builder who we have lost at the end of this past January. Before we start the conversation, today's conversation, I want to say quickly that this event is not meant to be a representative of all gender experiences of our students at Yale or in general, and neither is it really representative of our participants' gender experiences in and of itself, because they do, as they will share with you, they experience their own gender as changing and shifting. So it's more like a snapshot in time. And we're hoping that the conversation we have today will hopefully lead to other conversations other people will have with those in their lives. So that it is with that intention that we're having this conversation today. So let's start. I'm gonna ask you guys first to all introduce yourselves, maybe tell us your name, your year at Yale, your major if you want to, maybe where you're from if you want to, and then what pronouns you use. Let's start with Morgan.
Hi, my name's Morgan. I am a WGSS major. I would be a senior, but I'm currently on a leave of absence, and I am from Buffalo, New York.
And pronouns?
Oh, and yes, I use she or they pronouns, no preference.
Let's go to Domenic.
My name is Domenic or Layla. You can use any pronouns. I'm currently taking a year off from Yale, so I will now be in the class of 2023. I'm currently based in Philly, and I've been making a lot of visual art here.
And pronouns?
Oh, any pronouns. Oh, and then for my major, I'm a women's studies major, and I'm particularly interested in ethnobotany.
Thank you. Rahshemah?
Hi, my name is Rahshemah. I am a current junior at Yale. I am majoring in sociology and education studies. I'm planning on going into education. And my pronouns are they, them. I am from New Jersey, but I'm currently in New Haven near campus.
Thank you. And Sasha?
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm from Ottawa, Canada. I use they, them pronouns. I would be a junior at Yale, but I'm also taking time off this year. And I'm an English and WGSS double major.
Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you also so much for joining us today, even though you're technically off, a number of you. I really appreciate it. So next I'm going to ask you if you can each speak a little bit about how you understand your gender, and if you define it, how you define it. So that could be a conversation about terminology, what terms do you use, and what do those terms mean to you, because they don't mean the same thing to everyone. So a general kind of maybe laying out of how you understand your gender and the terminology that you use for it. So this time, let's start with Rahshemah.
So I identify as non-binary, which to me basically just means that I don't feel a strong connection to womanhood or masculinity. I don't necessarily feel like I fit into society's definition of what a woman is, and therefore I exist kind of outside of that realm. But I do still have very specific ties to femininity and womanhood. I'm very femme presenting. That is how I feel most comfortable presenting. And something that I've expressed to some of my friends is that I want to be feminine in the way that men get to be feminine. So to be feminine without the additional societal burden of like different expectations. But because I was raised in a society as a woman, I identify with a lot of those struggles and prejudices and discrimination that many women face. And that doesn't just go away because I'm non-binary, like it very much so shapes my experience. So I would say that I exist outside of the idea of womanhood as it's been constructed by society, but I still have very close ties to, like, because I grew up in this society, I have very close ties to like what it means to be a woman and a very close understanding of that, even though I don't identify that way.
Thank you, Rahshemah.
Oh, sorry, because I feel similarly. I also identify as non-binary, and I think, and what that means for me is I don't find like distinctions between man, woman, male, female, masculine, feminine, to be particularly, and the associations between those like analogous pairs to be particularly meaningful for me in my experience. In particular, I think my non-binariness, I think, mostly comes from a sense of disconnect between my embodiment or like biological sex and gender, that at least on my perception, like on my sort of understanding of how cisgender women or people who are female bodied, were assigned female at birth, identify as women, feel their gender, there is some sort of link between their embodiment and their gender that I don't share.
Thank you, Morgan. Shall we do Dominic next, and then Sasha?
Sure. I think the way I would like to approach this question is talking about how my understanding of my gender has sort of changed over time. I remember when I was very young, I kind of felt like I was treated as kind of like a sissy. So to me, that meant that I never really came out as a gay man because people never really treated me like a straight man anyway. Um, and I have some memories of like coming out to my sister at a young age, but the conversation wasn't very important. And at the time, I told her that I was gay. And I think this perception of myself started to change when I came to Yale and I started studying gender more analytically. And people started using they them pronouns to describe me before I even asked them to. And I guess I've always sort of felt that my experience of gender has been puzzling to other people. I think that's why I was treated as like a sissy at a young age and then a they them in my college age. But now I think about something very important in femininity and lesbianism, that I think is worth preserving. So I go sort of back and forth in this project of trying to live in like a post-gender kind of utopic vision where these things that like Morgan and Rahshemah seem to be describing of like wanting to like detach femininity from like the sort of social expectations, like wanting to live in a society where people don't feel restricted by these gender roles. But at the same time, I think there is something really important and worth protecting in lesbianism in the face of male sexual violence. So I kind of am situated now at a place where I'm looking at like lesbian superiority. And sometimes that means feeling a sense of dysphoria with my own masculinity, and like sometimes a dysphoria associated also with like the privileges of that masculinity. So I think now when people ask me to describe my gender, the closest thing I can do is point to people like Arca, who is this trans singer, and she talks a lot about her fans as mutants or feral girls. So I've updated my Instagram bio to say feral girl based in Philly. So that's where I'm at right now.
Sasha?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think I also identify as non-binary and have for a while. Like I've identified as non-binary for the last 5 or 6 years, but the way that I understand that has shifted, I think. And with that comes like an acknowledgement of the fact that like the way that I'm non-binary is not going to be the same way that another non-binary person is non-binary. So to me, it truly just functions as like an umbrella term articulating all sorts of genders that aren't male or female, which is where I am and where I sit, but in a different way to other people. So I feel like that's always important to kind of acknowledge and stress, because I think people see all non-binary people as somehow having like the same gender, which is not true. We all move through the world in very different gendered ways and have different gendered identities. In the last couple of years, I've also come to understand myself as a non-binary lesbian, which is a bit of a fraught term for me sometimes, but also like a helpful term for me sometimes. I'm not attracted to men, and I think that's like part of how I conceptualize my gender and my masculinity, and like the times when I don't feel like expressing masculinity. And yeah, so sometimes I wouldn't say that, you know, I feel like identical to a cisgender lesbian, or that my like lack of attraction to men kind of brings me closer to being a woman or something, because I feel like people tend to have that misconception. But when I do feel like defining my gender with more specificity, I talk of myself either as transmasculine, meaning that I kind of identify more with like masculinity than I was like assigned, or as a non-binary lesbian. But sometimes I think I don't particularly feel like even placing that on myself. I think it depends what company I'm in. And I used to feel like a really strong obligation to kind of justify the minutiae of my gender in like social situations. And now I'm more comfortable just being like, yeah, I'm non-binary. You can have the conceptions or misconceptions around that you want, but that's like how I feel within myself.
This is great. You guys, by the way, Domenic and Sasha's use of like lesbian is very resonant. I don't know if you have read her, but Monique Wittig's work is really in sort of what you're saying, which for her, a lesbian is not a woman. Anyway, a lesbian exceeds the category of woman and is not kind of containable by womanhood. And it's very interesting for me to kind of see the category of lesbian having resonance or sort of interestingness in a very good way. I was thinking of creating a class called the Lesbian Menace at some point, so maybe I'll speed that up. Okay, excellent. So next, I wanted to ask you guys what other factors of your being, your upbringing, your social position, do you think affect the way in which you understand and live your gender? So other ways in which you see yourself that interact with your gender and shape what it is. This time, let's start with Sasha.
Yeah. So I think a lot of definitely how I understand my gender is shaped by the way that I was brought up, I guess. I was always like brought up around, I don't want to like produce a misconception that like being around a lot of women made me trans or anything, but I was always like brought up around a lot of women and like a lot of in like a lot of peer groups that were entirely women, and like grew up with 3 younger sisters and everything. And I think in like, and I went to like an all girls summer camp or whatever, and eventually an all girls high school. And I think a lot of that experience, like from a young age, made me realize that like, kind of looking back to what Dominic was saying earlier, like that it's like other people sometimes can suss out that they're not going to actually fully perceive you or hold you like as a straight person or as a woman or as a man or whatever, even before you like figure that out for yourself. So I think definitely like it's impossible to extricate like gender from like social interactions and social conditions. And I was never really quite given the opportunity to like be perceived as like a woman or be perceived as doing womanhood like correctly. Even before I like entirely embraced my own masculinity, I always kind of felt like I was being treated as someone who would not properly enter into womanhood. It's kind of funny how like when you're little like children can figure that out before you do almost. So I think that's an important part of my gender for me. I think also I like tend to be more immediately perceived like as non-binary by people who like have like familiarity with non-binariness. I'm like a white person, a white transmasculine person with, you know, short hair and beanies and flannels, and very much like in a lot of my presentation, I kind of fall into how people like if someone was asked to draw a non-binary person, they probably draw someone close to me, which, you know, sometimes makes things kind of awkward or difficult, but also like allows me to be recognized in my gender in a way that like a lot of people don't necessarily get that and like get that way of moving through the world. So I think that's a particular kind of like contention and or privilege and or like just way of relating to my gender and way that people see it that affects my gender and sort of how I feel within myself. It's all tied up.
Thanks, Sasha. Can we go to Morgan next?
Yeah, I also went to girls' school, but for me, that was sort of a utopic moment because it was a very lovely, fantastic girls' school, that after I was no longer there, I actually ended up having a reckoning around what it meant to be a girls' school, around like folks were coming out as trans and like whether or not they still belonged in the community. But when I was there in that institution, there were a number of people in my class who didn't identify as women. And we just, you know, we had a little pod of gender weirdos, and it never, I, uh, I have never, I'm lucky enough, I think, to have always had a community of non-binary folks around me as long as I've felt non-binary or like a gender weirdo. Um, I think also, um, like this is sort of what like it was alluded to with the question, is like issues of like race and class and how those can determine our understanding of what gender is, and that definitely also shows up in this something I'm unpacking, degree to which perhaps my own like internalized racism provokes sort of resistance to Black femininity or femininity of color. In a way that is also classed, and that's like my own personal work that I'm thinking about and doing. But as a sort of third thing, also the question of naming myself is really interesting because it's not something I do ever, really. Nobody is ever asking me how I identify or what words I use. It's really in settings like this, where I am asked to name myself as non-binary, and I think um, the only other time that happened for me was like during my first year of college when I like integrated an all men's integrated, what was formerly an all men's singing group, and all of a sudden the front page of the YDN was like, it could have been first in the whatever group, or it could have been something else. And like, that's really the only moment on campus where I have like had to, where it felt like it mattered how I named myself. Because either something was going to be printed that was not accurate about me, or something that was going to be printed that was more accurate. And nobody was asking, so I had to do that intervention myself. But I think it's interesting to think about gender in public, and how that determines how we like articulate ourselves.
Before I turn to the next person, Morgan, can I quickly ask you, because we have a very wide audience and I don't want this moment to go by too fast. Can you explain your second point a little bit about your relationship to Black femininity, in case, with people no references, that might be a little bit hard to grasp in that quick, like 2 sentences, just if you want to say a couple of more sentences.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's tricky to say more about, but perhaps it's like most useful to think about dominant representations, that dominant representations of Black femininity, or femininity of color, differ from dominant representations. And when I say dominant representations, I'm talking about like film, books, primarily visual media, music and musicians, who gets airtime, uh, that I never really saw a place for myself in dominant representations of Black femininity. And so that is something. Who's to say, like, if I were in a different racialized body, whether or not I would identify as non-binary, because there would be more models of like traditional femininity that like I could identify with. But that's where I sit, if that helps.
That's super helpful. Thank you. That's exactly the kind of explanation I was hoping. I think that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Let's go to Domenic next.
I wanted to start answering this question and distancing myself a little bit from it, and referring to 2 authors that I think have made some really interesting and important arguments about this. The first being Afsaneh Najmabadi, and she talks a lot about her own work in studying gender in Iran. And particularly, she has this moment in her scholarship where she questions whether or not gender and sexuality are even useful analytics for her analysis. And I think this brings up a really important point about how even the categories of gender and sexuality and sexual orientations, along with the specific terms that we use within those categories, have very specific places and times that they exist and operate in. And unless we think very carefully about that, and unless we remember that gender is not inevitable and didn't always exist everywhere and won't always exist everywhere, we can make a lot of mistakes. And I think one mistake that another author, Jill Hochberg, talks about is the way that some like leftist-leaning queer writers, who she calls the queer international, impose a certain politics of gender onto Palestine and Palestinian activists that they label as queer. And that comes with a whole attached set of like leftists and anti-neoliberal politics. So there is this critique made by this queer international that these groups that they identify as queer in Palestine are not radical enough, are not anti-neoliberal enough. And I think this speaks to the way that these gender labels that we use are not just a representation of what we look like and who we want to have sex with. They're also attached to these larger views about what we imagine is possible for society, who we imagine does the labor that reproduces us. It has a lot to do with femininity. So bringing this back to my own response to the question, I wanted to emphasize how important growing up in an Anglo-American place so deeply affects how I understand my gender, because there are words available like gay to describe someone that looked like me as a child. And now there are words like non-binary and trans that are available to me at this age. And I think also I would like to extend this to not only being like a geographic place, but also a moment in like the information age, where there's like a platform like TikTok that has sort of established they, them as like a third gender. And that's something that I think can be identified on my body as well. I think that the way that I interpret myself has a lot to do with being surrounded by lesbians and non-binary people, and wanting to be like them and having conversations about not only what we think our gender is, but what we want our gender to be.
Thank you, Dominique. This actually reminds me the way in which sort of my best friend experienced moving from Turkey to America, which also meant moving from a language with no gender pronouns to English with gender pronouns, but also a language that has many more like words like trans man was not a word that was used when we moved here around the same time. But there were also no pronouns. So it was very interesting the way in which that there were some openings and some closures at the same time. Like things, like you had some more words for certain things, but the system also seemed a lot more rigid in terms of categorizing experiences. So it's interesting how sort of some tools and some in some way, I guess, quote unquote, freedoms come with also some chains. It's an interesting, I think, thing to think about. Rahshemah.
I think this is a really interesting question for me. Thinking about, I've done a lot of thinking in terms of labels and how they apply in retrospect, as well as in present moment. And I have had a lot of labels. I, for a long time, have been a person who identifies very strongly with labels just because it is a way and a lens through which I can view myself that makes sense. It's like putting on a pair of glasses and like you're looking at the same thing. It just sharpens the image a little bit more. And I think that for me, looking back, when I was very, very young, I got questions all the time. Are you a boy or a girl? I personally don't think I presented that androgynously, but I was a bit of a tomboy. A lot of my friends were boys. And I got that question all the time and I didn't think anything of it. And I remember answering once just like, I'm just me, like, why is that a question? And I don't think I remembered that moment until I came out as non-binary. I think that growing up, I had a lot of questions because I felt different than other people in ways that I didn't quite understand or have the language to describe. And a large portion of that had to do with my challenges and struggles with mental health. I have depression and ADHD, and that shapes how my mind works, but I didn't get diagnosed until I was in college. So I was just existing in the world with a slightly different brain, processing the world slightly differently, but I thought that was just how everyone existed. And I think to Morgan's point, the way the media presents Black women was something that I just did not feel that I connected to. I really want to honor my softness, and like the media often portrays Black women as like strong. Sometimes I feel like they shouldn't have to be that strong. They shouldn't like have to experience what they do. But I didn't feel strong. Like I am a very sensitive person. And I didn't feel like I identified with the way that society expected me to be as a Black woman, in terms of the way that I responded to certain stimuli, whether that was like the stereotypical like angry Black woman response or the like strong Black woman who's like able to handle anything that gets thrown at her. Like I didn't identify with either of those kind of tropes. And I remember in high school just starting to question my sexuality. We had a day of visibility, and there were a bunch of like pins laid out on a table that we could pick from, like whatever label you identified as. And I was like, I'm gonna go with ally. Ally seems like a safe choice. Let's pick ally. And as soon as I picked up the button, I was like, this is wrong. Like I knew in my mind that that was wrong, but I chose to ignore it. I did not want to process it. I was just like, nope, we're just gonna move on. And so I didn't question that much until I actually got to college and had the space to actually question things. And I think another part that contributes to this question is that growing up, I was often called an Oreo, which for people who are unfamiliar with the term, it's the idea of like a Black person who's white on the inside, which was very frustrating and traumatizing for me growing up. But I think also not strongly identifying with certain aspects of Black culture, and feeling as though my identity kind of existed outside of the expectations of Black culture from just the way that other Black women in my life were behaving, or acting. I talk differently, I listen to different music, I like different art. And I think that definitely shaped my perception of myself as outsider, which I think was important to my discovery of being non-binary, because I had kind of always existed outside of societal expectations of what I was quote unquote supposed to be. And when I got to college, I was introduced to the term non-binary for the first time, and I was like, oh, that's cool, and didn't think anything of it. I have many friends who are non-binary, and I was just like, awesome, that's great for them, that like makes sense. And a lot of them, like Sasha said, are the very stereotypical presentation of non-binary, like white, short hair, lots of flannels, cuff jeans, which was fine. But because of that, I never like considered that applying to me, because it just doesn't fit who I am and how I present. And I am a very feminine person. I feel like in the way that I present and the way that I behave. But there was a moment during quarantine, and I think quarantine had a lot to do with this, because once we were sent home, I was no longer interacting with people, and I no longer had to perform femininity in the way that I had been performing it before. I no longer felt like I was putting on like a costume. Like I wasn't embracing this, okay, well, I'm a girl and a girl's supposed to look like this. Like I didn't realize that part of my brain was trying to assimilate to society. Like no matter what I did, part of my brain was always like, this is what a normal person would do. This is what you're supposed to be acting like. And I would adjust my behavior accordingly based on the social situation that I was in. And because I was at home all the time, I no longer had to do that. And it's kind of, will probably get addressed later, so I won't go that deep into it. But I took a picture of myself, and just like a random picture, and I was just looking at it, and I could not for the life of me find anything in the picture that indicated that the person in the image was a girl. And I just sat there staring at that picture for literally hours, trying to pinpoint like what exactly it was I was experiencing. And that's when I started to question my gender a little bit more. And I think that like in terms of my social position, I just was always used to being different. And part of this realization that I had as I looked at that picture felt very comfortable. It felt very like, oh, okay, that just makes sense. Like you're not a girl. Okay, cool. But another part of me, as somebody who does have so many marginalized identities, being Afro-Indigenous, being queer, being like at that point I realized that I was queer. Like having mental illnesses and certain disabilities that are tied into those mental illnesses, and being low income, I very much so did not want another marginalized label. And so that was really hard for me processing as I discovered my gender. And I think that I, over time, especially now, became more comfortable in just, I identify how I identify and I don't have a label on it. Like the word that I use is queer. If somebody asks me, I say that I'm non-binary, but I'm just me. Like I don't change because my label changes. And I think that's really important to note. Or like I don't change just because somebody learns of my label. Like I'm the same person that they knew before they knew this additional information about me. And I think that specifically is very important to my identity in terms of my sexuality feels very fluid. I've used lots of different labels in the past, and I'm sure that that will continue to change in the future. And some days I feel very neutral about gender. Like I'm not a girl, like I do not exist. I am just a blob of a body. And other days I feel very feminine and I feel very tied to traditional ideas of femininity and womanhood. And that changes day to day and even hour to hour. So I feel like I've begun to embrace just I exist and being okay with that reality. That was really long, I'm sorry.
No, it was great. It was great. Thank you. So next I have next I have a question about, well, I guess it's more like an ask that you share maybe a story with us, with the audience, about a moment where you've experienced gender affirmation and a moment where you felt like a lack of affirmation, even if it was well intended. Because I think that for a wider audience, it might be nice to hear how these things can play out. So if stories come to mind through which they can, are we together still? Can you hear me? Okay. It would be nice to have sort of stories through which people can maybe understand the complex ways in which these things can unfold. I'm getting a reduced performance warning, but let's hope that everything's going to work out. Okay, who shall we start with? I don't think we started with Morgan yet, so let's start with Morgan, unless you need a bit more time to think. What do you think?
My internet went out, so I asked the question. It was a moment of generation, and someone else can go first, and I'll catch.
Okay, let's start with Rahshemah.
So when you asked that question, a couple of things came immediately to mind. I think for one moment that I experienced gender affirmation, it was such a small moment, really negligible in the grand scheme of things, but it was just this one moment where I just felt like myself and I felt seen as myself. And I have a friend on campus who is a year older than me, and she's basically my mom on campus. I call her my mom. She is a wonderful person, so kind, and she called me her daughter like all the time, like, this is my daughter Rahshemah, like I'm so excited for you to meet her, like, oh my gosh, she's wonderful. And that was just like how we interacted. That was our dynamic. And I posted on Instagram that, like, asking people to use they them pronouns for me, and without missing a beat. Like I didn't ask her specifically. She had just seen this and she texted me and she was like, my child, how are you? And that little switch, like I get like chills thinking about it still, like that simple switch from like daughter to child, just like immediately her understanding exactly what I needed and like putting that first was like such a moment of gender euphoria for me, of like, yes, child, like that, yes, that is how I exist. And it was something that I hadn't thought about before because I had just started using they them pronouns and I wasn't using them with everybody. I wasn't out to everybody. And I was still very much so exploring gender neutral language. And so I hadn't even considered the word child before to describe somebody. And that moment just really like, even with just the simple switch of language and something very similar, I'm in a sorority, and I was really scared to come out to my sorority because sororities are typically all feminine spaces, like they're all women's spaces. And I I didn't make a big fuss about it. I just texted in the group chat. I was like, I use they, them pronouns, okay, bye. And everybody liked the message. Everybody was super great about it. And instead of calling me sister the way that like you at like your sorority sisters, they call me sibling now. And that, like, again, simple language change, like, makes me just feel so warm and fuzzy inside, and that's like really wonderful. And then a slightly more tangible moment of gender affirmation was when I got my first binder. One of my friends was very, very kind and gave me one of their old binders that they no longer needed. And I am a person who doesn't experience like an extreme amount of gender dysphoria. I generally feel comfortable in my body. I have days where I just would rather not have a body at all, but it's not like a gendered issue. I don't mind the body that I have, but when I got my first binder, it was a magical experience because I was able to have full control over the way that I present it to the outside world. For people who don't know what a binder is, it's a piece of clothing that you can wear to bind your chest so that your breasts are less apparent. It flattens your chest for you. And I got my binder and I put on a t-shirt, and that was just like, wow, magical. And it layered, and I put on the binder and I put on a dress, and that was a moment of just such clarity of like, yes, this is what I feel like this is what I am. And I feel like I mentioned this earlier, but like being feminine in the way that men get to be feminine, that was what that felt like to me. And I think that was really important. And then a moment where I felt lack of affirmation, even when well-intended, a lot of people use gendered language as like slang. So like cis and girl and stuff like that. And normally, if it's like a friend or somebody who I know knows me, it doesn't bother me that much. But there have been instances where I've literally just told people that I use they, them pronouns, and they'll say like something like cis or girl and address me in that way. And that's incredibly upsetting to me. Like, I just explained to you that I don't identify that way, and you're still addressing me in a way that makes me uncomfortable. And I think that the main thing that I've been talking about is just the language that you use is so, so important. And for me, the language matters less than how I believe people perceive me. So I have friends who, one of my very best friends, I've known him for 11 years. He's a wonderful person. He does not understand the pronouns thing at all. Just like it goes entirely over his head. And so he still uses she, her pronouns for me, but because he's known me for so long and I feel confident that he knows exactly who I am and he's not seeing me in the way that society sees a woman, if that makes sense, I don't feel uncomfortable by that, even though I prefer they, them pronouns. So I think that the lack of affirmation that I felt throughout my experience is just the intent behind people's words and the effort that they put into them, not necessarily the words themselves. So like with the child example, like my friend went out of her way to make sure that I felt safe and included, and that's what made me feel special. And I think that having that be the forefront of people who like are cis and like have friends who are non-binary, like it matters how you see me. Like, it's not enough to just use they, them pronouns. Like, I need you to not see me as a girl. Like, I need you to not think, oh, she uses they, them pronouns, which a lot of people have done in my interactions with them. And so I think like that's the important thing for me in terms of like making me feel validated, is just demonstrating to me in whatever way that is that you don't perceive me as a woman.
Sasha had to leave to be at an appointment, but the three of us will conclude the conversation. Rahshemah might also have to leave in a few minutes, but we were nearing the end anyway. So since you have to go, Rahshemah, I'll ask you quickly, what does it mean to you to be a good supportive ally? What do you recommend to family members or friends of genderqueer, non-binary, or trans people about how they can be kind, caring, and supportive? And you shared a little bit of that as you talked about kind of affirmative moments, but if you had anything else to add, and then I'll turn to Domenic and Morgan.
I think for me personally, the most supportive thing that you can do is to educate yourself more about what it means to be non-binary and what it means to be trans, and like make sure that you're exploring other trans experiences, because obviously mine is not the only trans experience and mine is not the only non-binary experience. But I think that as long as you are putting in the effort to actually educate yourself on like the experience of your loved one who does identify as trans or non-binary, like that's probably the biggest thing. I think something else is being mindful of, I've already said this, but I think it's important, being mindful of the language that you use, and like taking that extra step to not only just shift your language, but like we get into habits with the words that we say and the way that we talk, and making that extra effort to shift that around certain people to make them more comfortable. It doesn't cost you anything. So that's definitely a big one. And I think not putting all of the responsibility on your loved one who is non-binary or trans to explain their experience to you, because not everybody feels comfortable like talking about the minutia of how they identify. Some people are still figuring out how they identify. And so in order to be a good friend to them, just make sure that you're there with them through the process and that you're accepting of them even as they transition and change, because like I said before, labels can be very fluid. Gender is very fluid, and people learn about themselves every day. Like they learn new things about themselves, and just be present with those people throughout that process, because it might not be necessarily convenient to you, but it will make a world of difference for this person. I'm thinking specifically with like neopronouns, like those might be hard to get used to, but like making just that effort to like switch your language and switch your pronouns would like be so helpful to like your friend or loved one who identifies as non-binary, and just showing that you're coming from a place of love. It's okay to mess up, because everyone will mess up. I mess up with my friends occasionally and I feel really bad about it, but the best thing you can do is to like acknowledge it and then move on. I think one big thing that I wish people, like other people knew, is to not say sorry when you mess up somebody's pronouns or like refer to them incorrectly. Correct yourself and then move on, because when you say sorry, it puts the non-binary person in a position to be like, no, it's okay, when it's not okay. So I think that's the other big thing, is just taking like self-accountability for your actions and not putting that responsibility to like improve yourself on your non-binary friend or loved one.
Thank you, Rahshemah. So let me turn to Domenic and ask this question about like a story, an experience of gender affirmation, and maybe well-meaning, but you know, uncomfortable, like gender, like lack of gender affirmation. If there are stories you want to share.
Sure. So I think the first thing that came to mind for an experience of gender affirmation was when my roommate recently paid for me to get a set of acrylic nails for my birthday. It was like about a week ago. And I had never had them before. And it was just so fun to like look at my hands. And like the first thing I said when I got the nails was like, I don't know how to be sad with these because it's just too distracting. And like I just can't stop talking about it. And it's just been so fun. And it's kind of it's something that I have been thinking about for months, and everyone told me like, oh, like you shouldn't get acrylics, like you should get something other kind of thing on your nail. It's so annoying, it's so irritating, like you won't be able to do anything, like you can't wipe your butt. And I was like, oh, never. Like I thought about it for months. It's time. Like I'm ready to adjust to this lifestyle. That being said, I probably won't get them refilled this time just because like I think I'll get tired of it, but super fun. And then a moment where I felt a lack of affirmation, even if well intended. What came to mind with this is the way that I sometimes feel like a spectacle in some places. I think in particular around like some straight women who just will like walk up to me at a party or something and like just have an extremely exaggerated reaction to how I look. And sometimes it's kind of fun because I'm like, okay, like I do look good and like I spent hours getting ready. But also like you can move on. Like I don't know. It's also I'm hoping that like one day I'll perform in drag and then at that point it's like, okay, well I'm getting tips, so that's why I look so good. But like just feeling like a spectacle, especially in like more casual settings. Like I've experienced this like going to a friend's birthday party and just like I hadn't met some of their other straight friends, and everyone wanted to take pictures with me, and it's kind of sweet, but at the same time, it can be kind of fetishizing or othering in a way that is not always the best to feel.
Thank you, Dominic and Morgan.
Yeah, I can bundle these two questions since it seems like we're wrapping up. I think the moments where I feel most, or my gender identity is quite analytic, I would say, at least more analytic than felt, and something that I find affirming. And when I say more analytic than felt, that doesn't make it less real, and I think that's important. Something that I find affirming is when my friends who don't identify as non-binary or trans are also thinking about their gender and what it means to them. Um, this this like sort of shared understanding that gender is something that all of us have and that many of us have drama around, and that many of us have like positive feelings and euphoria around, that I think de-exoticizes what it can what Dominic just described about, the ways in which being a gender weirdo can feel like a spectacle, or can be perceived as a performance. And I think what like the regarding what folks can do to to show and act upon allyship, or a sense of like being in shared community and shared space. I think not making assumptions is important, and we sort of started here with the framing, or the disclaimer that the four of us who are here in New Evren are not like doing some sort of grand treatise on the state of gender now. We're not like forecasting what gender will be like in the future. We are, or at least I am, if to speak from the I perspective, um, talking some about the way that I experience my gender and not all of it, because this is like a public space with its limitations, and the way that I feel and think about my gender doesn't translate, or may not translate between other folks who maybe look like me or sound like me or talk like me or don't, and like might not even be something that I agree with in like 2 weeks or a year from now. Um, so the understanding that things are changing, or that at least like for me, things are changing, and a willingness to keep up, because I think, you know, we're willing to do that in other areas of people's lives, but gender is one that seems to be particularly tricky for some folks.
Thank you, Morgan. And before I turn to Domenic for the last question, I also want to say that it's important to emphasize, as Morgan was doing that, so for instance, 2 of our friends didn't end up joining the event because they didn't want to go on record, on permanent record, like visually to on an event like this. So that already says that we didn't even get to have the initial kind of ideal scenario that we wanted, and therefore there will be anyway always some voices missing from these kinds of conversations because of the like limitations of the format, etc. But at the same time, that people don't think of their genders as like fixed, kind of in time and place anyway, and that's really important to remember too. The way it would be presumptuous for us to imagine that we're representative of anything, it is presumptuous to think that you already always know the people you know, and you're done knowing them. Thank you, Morgan and Domenic.
Yeah, to respond to the last question about being a supportive ally, I think my first reaction is to say what being a supportive ally doesn't look like. And it doesn't mean, being a supportive ally does not mean going up to the trans and non-binary people and saying, I want to be a supportive ally to you, and I want to support you in your gender and your gender identity. Because I think this is similar to reacting to someone at a party in like a way that is exoticizing and fetishizing. I think being a good ally starts with respecting pronouns. And that's just a simple way of respecting someone like a name. And for some people who are trans and non-binary, this is more or less important. Like for me, I opened by saying that I would use any pronouns, even like a fun neo pronoun, like try it out. You can call me Faye Fair, sure. But for some people, it's important that you respect a very specific pronoun, and it's very similar to a name. And this isn't very complicated. It's kind of simple because people are just telling you what to refer to them as. And I think being a good ally is mostly just providing for people's basic like emotional and material needs. I think for a lot of people who, especially those with class privilege, being a good ally means opening your wallet. It means donating your money to sex workers. It means making sure people in your community have the material necessities in life. It means giving money to Black trans women. It means dedicating a part of your income every week or every month for alimony and for charity. So I think these practices are just kind of how you show respect to anyone. I don't think it's very specific, and I don't think it needs to be a very specific mode of allyship for trans and queer people.
Thank you both and all so much. Like I'm gonna imagine that Rahshemah and Sasha are kind of still here in spirit. Any last things that you guys want to add? Otherwise, we'll say thank you for being so generous with your time and your kind of your knowledge. And I hope that this is, and I think it will be actually quite interesting and useful for many of the Yale alumni. So I thank you all.